Vanessa del Rio's life story is as colorful and boundary-pushing as the era that birthed her rise to stardom. She was born Ana Maria Sanchez on March 31, 1952, in Harlem, New York, though the name Vanessa del Rio would eventually eclipse her birth identity in ways few could have anticipated. For a girl growing up in a neighborhood buzzing with the rhythm and grit of New York City, there was no straightforward path to fame, especially not the kind of fame that would cause her to be both lionized and demonized in almost equal measure. Yet her journey through the adult entertainment world, starting in the early 1970s, blazed a trail of self-determination, cultural rebellion, and scandal that continues to fascinate people decades later. Today, at the age of 72, alive and well as of March 20th, 2025, she lives in relative quiet, a striking contrast to the tumult that once surrounded her name. But to truly understand why Vanessa del Rio became a lightning rod for debates on sexuality, race, and women's empowerment, we have to rewind to a time when adult films were shifting from a seedy backroom affair to a cultural phenomenon that unsettled traditional moral boundaries. Her entry into the industry happened almost by accident. In 1974, strapped for cash and worried about rent, she found herself offered $150 to appear in a film titled China Doll. That might sound like a pittance in a world where adult film could be extraordinarily lucrative for top stars. But in the early 70s, $150 could be the difference between keeping a roof over one's head or landing in a homeless shelter. There was no grand plan, no calculated career move. Vanessa simply needed the money. The decision changed the trajectory of her life, launching her into a realm that most people either misunderstood entirely or judged harshly from the outside. China Doll wasn't some high-budget extravaganza. It was a scrappy production, one among many in a burgeoning adult film scene that was eager for new talent. But for Vanessa, this single appearance opened the door to everything that followed: stardom, infamy, and a level of scandal that would place her in the crosshairs of cultural critics. At that time, the adult film industry was often described as the Wild West, thanks to its loose regulations, questionable management, and uncharted territory in terms of mainstream acceptance. Yet even in that environment, there was a clear hierarchy. White performers tended to dominate marquee roles, while people of color were either relegated to minor parts or exoticized for niche appeal. Vanessa del Rio, however, was not one to be relegated or sidelined. Of Cuban and Puerto Rican heritage with a proud Afro-Latina identity, she faced a double-edged sword. She was unique, someone who could stand out in an industry saturated with blonde or otherwise Eurocentric faces. But she also found herself up against significant discrimination. Producers sometimes hesitated to put her in starring roles, fearing the potential backlash or smaller box office returns from a primarily white audience. They worried that an interracial or interethnic scene might alienate conservative viewers or cause controversy with distributors in certain regions. Yet that very controversy became part of Vanessa's persona. If producers were concerned about crossing lines, she was prepared to cross them with gusto. She brought an energy to her performances that few could rival. Her trademark was an unapologetic enthusiasm for sex on screen, an authenticity that audiences gravitated toward. In an era where adult performers often delivered awkward or mechanical performances, her presence felt real, raw, and refreshingly honest. The camera caught her playful humor as much as it captured her sexuality. That dual vibe, eroticism and irreverent humor, became her calling card. So while some segments of mainstream society were horrified at the thought of a woman of color, in an industry already considered taboo, proclaiming her sexuality so openly, fans absolutely adored her. They saw in Vanessa a kind of rebellious spirit that said, "I'm here, I'm enjoying myself, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Still, the fallout from being a performer of color in the 1970s adult film world was never far behind. Racially charged remarks followed her everywhere, from casting sessions to promotional events. She would sometimes arrive on set and discover that certain co-stars were reluctant to participate in interracial scenes, or that certain theaters in more conservative states refused to screen films that prominently featured a non-white star. Navigating this reality was exhausting. On one hand, Vanessa was building a loyal fan base that spanned diverse backgrounds, but on the other, she knew there were real economic and social barriers in place, barriers her white peers often didn't have to face. Far from being daunted, though, she channeled the adversity into her persona, essentially telling the world, "If you can't handle it, I'm going to give you even more." It was a bold move that cemented her reputation as not just a star, but a fighter, someone who refused to let racism or prejudice dictate her career. By the late 1970s, Vanessa del Rio had become a marquee name. Her filmography expanded with titles like The Filthy Rich and Dracula Exotica, films that, while undeniably explicit, also carried a certain campy charm that resonated with audiences seeking something different from the typical formula of adult features. Her scenes often involved an unbridled enthusiasm, full of laughter, moans, or playful banter, underscoring that she was not simply performing, but genuinely engaging with the moment. Such candor on camera broke a taboo that many adult performers adhered to: the idea that they should be acting rather than truly experiencing. Vanessa brought an undercurrent of reality to her roles. Sometimes it was comedic, sometimes it was passionately intense, but it was always her. And because she was so singular in her approach, scandal followed almost inevitably, especially when she participated in explicit group scenes or interracial settings that conservative viewers deemed unthinkable. Critics of the time, particularly those aligned with the conservative family values movements, cited Vanessa as an example of everything wrong with the sexual revolution. They portrayed her work as morally corrosive, a sign that society was descending into depravity. Religious leaders in certain communities argued that her films did more damage because she carried a sense of pride and humor in her sexual expressiveness, an attitude they felt could corrupt younger audiences into believing that pornography was harmless or even celebratory. The irony was that the more these groups railed against her, the more intriguing she became to a broader swath of the public. Nothing piques curiosity like a taboo figure who refuses to back down. As a result, her premieres drew mobs of fans. She'd step off a bus or a car at some adult theater and people would gather around her, seeking an autograph or simply hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman who embodied so many controversies. Amid the swirl of scandal and fame, Vanessa del Rio embraced a personal philosophy that was radical for the time: sex positivity. She believed that consenting adults had every right to explore their desires without shame. In her 2007 biography, Vanessa del Rio, 50 Years of Slightly Slutty Behavior, she reflects on how her outlook was shaped by her experiences, growing up in a culture that often policed women's sexuality, particularly women of color. She realized early on that many social mores were designed to stifle free expression, and that the adult film world, for all its flaws, offered her a unique platform to challenge those constraints. Yes, her choice came with plenty of stigma, but it also allowed her to flip the script on who got to control her body and her narrative. The biography itself is a perfect encapsulation of her take me or leave me ethos. She invites readers to see every facet of her life, the good, the bad, and the unapologetically raunchy, and then dares them to judge. Not all her adventures on set were carefully choreographed or glamorous. One anecdote that exemplifies Vanessa's ability to laugh off the absurd: she once had a scene involving a cucumber that, shall we say, didn't go according to plan. While other performers might have been mortified, she treated it like a comedic mishap, chortling about the weirdness of using props in hardcore scenes. This capacity to find humor in precarious situations endeared her to colleagues and fans alike. She seemed genuinely unafraid of anything that happened in front of the camera, a persona that was half warrior, half comedian. Despite all the hype and scandal, the adult film world of the late 70s and early 80s was on the cusp of a massive transformation, and not necessarily for the better. As the industry moved away from the cinematic porno chic era into the home video boom, budgets shrank, corners were cut, and star performers faced new pressures to produce content rapidly. The sense of novelty that characterized the early golden age of adult film began to fade. Vanessa, who had spent nearly a decade thriving in the big screen environment, felt these changes acutely. There was also a growing moral and legal backlash from both local and federal authorities, fueled by conservative groups, that made it harder for producers to operate openly. Under these conditions, adult film became less of an adventurous domain and more of a corporate, profit-driven machine. And then came the biggest crisis of all: AIDS. By the mid-1980s, the HIV/AIDS epidemic had begun to devastate communities across the globe, but it hit the adult film industry with particular force. Performers were suddenly terrified for their lives, not just their livelihoods. Vanessa del Rio, who had up to that point been fearless about pushing boundaries, became painfully aware of how dangerous unprotected on-camera sex could be without rigorous testing protocols. She watched friends and acquaintances in the business fall ill and die at an alarming rate. The carefree hedonism that had once fueled the industry's scandalous image was now overshadowed by a very real and mortal threat. In 1986, she decided to retire from adult films. The AIDS crisis was a significant factor in her decision. Though she had always been open about her sexual liberation, she recognized that her well-being was at stake in an industry that had yet to fully adopt consistent testing or safety measures. She later recalled in interviews the emotional toll of seeing people she cared about dropping like flies, unsure of who might be next. This was the era before advanced antiretroviral therapies, when an HIV diagnosis was widely viewed as a death sentence. As an industry icon who commanded a sizable fan base, her choice to step away contributed to the wider sense of alarm. It was as if her retirement underscored the severity of the situation. If Vanessa del Rio, a woman famous for her audacious spirit, saw no safe way to continue, then the crisis must be dire indeed. Yet the lure of performing proved difficult to resist. Briefly, between 1986 and 1987, she returned for a handful of projects, including Deep Inside Vanessa del Rio and The Devil in Miss Jones 3. Some fans were thrilled to see her back. Others criticized the move, worrying that she was risking her health in an environment still fraught with dangers. Industry insiders debated whether her reappearance hinted that things were improving or whether it was simply a case of a star missing the rush of performing. Either way, her cameo comeback caused another ripple of scandal. Critics accused her of promoting recklessness, while supporters argued that any performer had the right to make an informed choice about their body and work. Ultimately, her second retirement soon after affirmed that the climate was still too precarious for her comfort. With her final exit from adult film in the late 1980s, many might have expected Vanessa del Rio to fade into obscurity or descend into the tragic narrative that befell numerous adult stars of the era: struggles with addiction, poverty, or health crises. Instead, she pivoted. She spent some time feature dancing in clubs, capitalizing on her celebrity status to earn money through live performances rather than on-camera work. Fans would line up to see her up close, sometimes hoping to chat or get an autograph, other times just to witness that electric energy in person. But live performances carried their own risks. In 1996, she tore her meniscus during an on-stage act, an injury that forced her to reevaluate yet again how she wanted to earn a living. The physical toll of dancing, even in her 40s, proved significant, and she had to make the pragmatic choice to step away from that scene too. Fortunately, Vanessa had a hidden advantage: some early coding skills. Unusual as it might sound for an adult film star of her generation, she had enough computer literacy to recognize the burgeoning potential of the internet. In the mid to late 1990s, the online world was exploding, and adult content was among the first industries to realize its commercial viability. She built a website, engaging directly with fans in a new digital realm, thereby maintaining a presence in the adult world without risking health or physical injury. Through this platform, she could offer Q&A sessions, sell memorabilia, and maintain a degree of control over her image. No longer was she at the mercy of producers or distributors who might exploit her name. Now she could shape her brand on her own terms. Her cameo appearances in mainstream media also helped keep her name alive, albeit more subtly than during her heyday. In 2008, she made a quick appearance in Soul Men, a comedy film starring the late Bernie Mac and Samuel L. Jackson. It wasn't a huge role, but it was a nod to her long-standing cultural presence. By then, she was an icon for those who remembered the golden years of the adult film explosion, and a novelty for younger audiences hearing about her for the first time. Small moments like this cameo signaled that Vanessa del Rio was more than her scandalous past. She could poke fun at her former image, step into a mainstream production, and exit gracefully. All the while, rumors about her death cropped up periodically. The adult entertainment industry is no stranger to sensational claims, often reporting the demise of older stars without verifying sources. Vanessa's name occasionally got pulled into the rumor mill, particularly when, for months or years on end, she stayed out of the spotlight. But these rumors proved unfounded. Platforms like Dead or Kicking updated her status as still alive, reinforcing that she had not followed the tragic path of some of her contemporaries. People sometimes forget how many adult performers succumb to drug abuse, financial ruin, or health complications in an era where resources for performer safety and personal development were scarce. Vanessa managed not only to survive but to thrive, each reinvention shaping another chapter in her unpredictable life. Even more recently, in 2019, discussions began circulating about The Latin from Manhattan, a biopic centered on Vanessa's story. Given her pivotal role in both adult film history and the broader conversation about race and sexuality, it made sense that her life would attract the interest of filmmakers. If the project proceeds to completion, as was planned, starting production in 2019, it stands to shine a new light on an extraordinary woman whose story straddles multiple cultural flashpoints, from the days of peep show booths and 42nd Street adult theaters, to the birth of home video porn, to the meltdown brought on by the AIDS crisis, and onward into the digital revolution. The film's mere existence underscores the enduring fascination with Vanessa del Rio's life. She didn't just pass through an industry, she shaped it, challenged it, and in many ways outlasted some of its harshest obstacles. Today, at 72 years old, Vanessa del Rio has largely retreated from any sustained spotlight. Those who search for her online might find social media tributes, references to her cameo roles, or photos from her prime. She occasionally emerges for special appearances, signings, or interviews. But the raucous chapters of her career are now well behind her. This subdued lifestyle stands in stark contrast to her earlier reputation, which was all about defiance and spontaneity. One imagines that she might have relished the calm after so many years of living under a torrent of scandal, moral outrage, and adoring fans. It must be a relief to move through the world without the constant glare of tabloid sensationalism or the prying eyes that once judged her every move. In the end, her story is about survival in a world that so often devours its free spirits, especially those who dare to be open about desires and identities that society deems taboo. It's about cultural shifts and moral battles set against the backdrop of a New York City that was itself undergoing massive transformations. It's about grappling with identity, religious, familial, ethnic, sexual, and forging a path uniquely one's own. It's about the painful lessons of public disgrace and the quiet joys of discovering there is life beyond the spotlight. It's about a person who many tried to flatten into a caricature of sin or seduction, but who insists on existing as a full human being.